Yes, sir.
Now, the thing is my understanding is that CO2 is not toxic, or I shouldn't say it's not toxic in the least, but...
the dose makes the poison.
Yeah, the doses you're likely to come into are not going to be toxic. I think the problem with CO2 isn't the weather change.
The climatology change?
Yeah.
But they're bootlegging it. Then they're bootlegging it by saying it's a toxin to achieve something that they can't do otherwise.
Yeah.
Correct. And if you go to EPA's own regulatory rules, they define a NESHAP, okay, which is a toxin. Here are the characteristics of a toxin. They're bootstrapping this. They're saying, well, it's an indirect toxin because it's creating climate change, which is predicted and not proved. So yeah, I agree with you. And watch this. I just drank CO2. Okay. Right, it's everywhere, and it's profoundly important to our biology.
But I mean, isn't like James Hansen, the NASA Goddard chief climatologist? He says he's one voice, but he's given his background, I would say a very persuasive voice that. It builds up in the atmosphere and it causes the greenhouse effect. And many other climatologists have said the same thing. So, I mean, that's the issue, right? It's not whether, you can drink it or it's in the air.
No, that's not what EPA said. They said it's a toxin.
It's a poison.
It's a poison.
Inherently a poison. And sir, you bring up the right point. What we're saying with this book is, in theory, in principle, you could take any scientific trajectory, like the theory of global climate change, and the climate is changing. It always is changing. If you look at the past 400,000 years, average temperatures have gone up and down like this, in scallops like that, right? So you could be in a strategic upturn, but in a tactical downturn at any given time. Climate is always changing. There's no question about that. The question in play is, to what degree is man causing climate change, so that we can identify who victims are and who's guilty, and so we can correct that problem. In science, we're saying we're not looking at victims, we're not looking at villains, we're simply saying what is the real science. And our contention here is, no, if this whole BAS is right, you could impanel any group of scientists and say, what are the right questions with regard to global climate change and human interaction? What are the answers? What do we know? What level category of science is global climate change theory? And any group of impaneled scientists, we think, if they use this procedure or something like this, would come to the same conclusion. And that is, we can't do experiments with the climate. We can look at correlations. Here's what we think. Here are the lures of mechanism, and not get emotional about it and just say, we're at category 2C. Do you want to make a decision about life based on a category 2C decision? Well, let me just tell you something. At this stage in my career, I can afford that $5,000 device on my car. But you know what? The guy making minimum wage has to buy the exact same instrument for his car. And he can't afford it the way I can. So we really need to think this through. Do I have a conclusion about global climate change? It's open science as far as I'm concerned. Yes, sir.
I don't know if you know this off the top of your head. I mean, if the CO2 average in the background is in the range of a few hundred parts per million, when you exhale, what is the typical parts per million number?
On exhale, it's going to be, I'm doing this off the top of my head, it's going to be less than, it's going to be significantly less than the 25,000. But I don't know what it is exactly. I can find out. In fact, I have a call in to my favorite physiologist, Jim Giordano, to answer exactly that question. So other questions, comments, challenges? Yes, sir.
Well, I should point out that in last week's ruling, which is separate from the Massachusetts versus EPA ruling. So yeah, we're talking about two different rulings, two different cases, two different processes. But in the case of last week's ruling, yes, the EPA said, we wish it hadn't gone this way. Yeah, we wish that it had gone legislatively, that a law should have been passed. says, okay, EPA, we give you responsibility X, authority Y, blah 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 Z. So yes, they do admit that it was a roundabout and unfortunate way to go about things.
Yeah.
They basically put a gun at the head of the legislative branch, which is, in the theory of our government balance of power, is just an odious conduct.
And back, sir.
Yeah. Does the precautionary principle enter into this discussion?
In waves and droves, absolutely. For those of you who are not familiar with the precautionary principle, it's the notion that in terms of signal noise theory, let's say a new product is derived, and Europe uses the precautionary principle a lot. The notion is you have to prove that your product is safe, otherwise it doesn't get into our market, rather than that someone has to prove that it's unsafe, right? What this inhibits is entrepreneurialism from mom and pop shops. Your big corporations can do the precautionary principle challenge, whereas the little guy cannot, it is argued. Does it enter here? Yes, absolutely. Because again, remember the dilemma that I said is in our struggle is that scientists begin with the null hypothesis that A is not related to B. And then A is found to be related to B, and then C, A, it seems, causes B. And so the precautionary principle says, we don't know that A does not cause B, therefore you don't exist. You can't enter the market. And the scientific approach says, you're back to null hypothesis testing, not the other way around. Yes, sir.
If I understand your BA proposes that review panels be set up to inform decision makers, and that they would assess the level of the science, and then at least that much would be known when people make policy that we're dealing with a Category 2 or Class 2 or whatever.
But it goes further, and I'm just interrupting you for a second. It does exactly what you just said, but it also says you dismiss this panel, bring in another panel of scientists, don't tell them what panel 1 said. Our claim is they'll come to the same conclusion. If we get this right, that any group of scientists who know how to ask questions will come to the same conclusion. And maybe you're blind. They don't know that it's about global climate change. It's about phenomenology, right? And they would come to the same conclusion.
Better panel participation than the peer review, the bad examples of peer review that you talked about. I mean, there are human factors there. But